The Great Awakening held tremendous significance for the emergence of the Black church in America. Initially, it created room to unite competing worship expressions, but eventually the spiritual priorities gave way to social preferences. As the impact of those revivals began to wane, the dominance of white influence gradually began to marginalize Black participation in their churches. One author writes this way: white church members were not nearly as happy as their Black colleagues were with the spontaneity and free expressiveness of Great Awakening style worship. And these churches, especially in the South, were often culturally overwhelmed in worship with sizable and irrepressible majorities of non-voting Black members. In addition to these limitations were a limit on the number of trained pastors, as well as the severe shortage of seating in churches. It left Blacks to be little more than an inconvenience in white congregations. In fact, the inevitable push towards fully segregated worship was tied to other factors such as class, culture, and control. As whites pursued social and economic upward mobility, they found decreasing tolerance for sharing their sacred spaces with those who they felt were inferior. In addition, many became increasingly embarrassed by the freedom of expressive worship, which they had embraced through the revivals. So what for Blacks had been an affirmation of their African culture became for whites only momentary acknowledgement. But perhaps the most impactful point of separation of cultures dealt with the idea of control. Mitchell writes this: whether whites exited mixed congregations and formed their own, or whites invited the Blacks to exit and form their own separate congregation, the Black group was always thought of as a white church's mission, subordinate to the sponsoring church. This arrangement was inevitable because of the legal requirement for white sponsors and guarantors. Without such, the government prohibited Blacks from gathering for mass worship at all. This point of development in the story is what makes it nearly impossible to pinpoint the first truly Black church. Because while Black congregations began appearing in the North and South during this time, they were not allowed to exist independent of white influence. Imagine a Black church where the land is owned by whites, the building is owned by whites, the preaching is dictated by whites, and the majority of the members are owned by whites. Which meant that real independence for the Black church unfolded in varying degrees, at varying times, in varying places across a resistant country. And so even in that, we find the beauty of the Black church. The legacy of the Black church reminds us that we can accept God's tendency to move slowly, even while trusting His will to unfold certainly. As such, the Black church persisted to carve out its place. African believers went to extraordinary lengths to preserve and advance their faith. Their mere presence in a foreign and oppressive land challenged them to open their minds in increasing measure to the sovereignty of God. One story in particular stands out. The history of First African Baptist Church of Philadelphia records 2 members volunteering to return to slavery for a year as bond for an enslaved preacher whom their church called their pastor. He was to earn his purchase price during that year away, and that he did. Imagine that. 2 members became slaves so that their enslaved pastor could be free for their church. Now, that might be the most impressive pastor appreciation that I have ever heard of. But then again, that is the legacy of the Black church. A worship tradition that is characterized by the willingness to offer the most extraordinary levels of sacrifice just to make the most incremental steps of progress. We should all be paying attention.